Africa is the largest country and one of the dominant forces in North African politics. Algeria is an important player on the world stage. However, the country has faced a long and arduous journey, battling colonialism, political infighting, and even the horror of the Civil War along the way. In this episode of Untangling Africa, we're looking at the instability and the atrocities that characterized the first decades of Algeria's history as a modern, independent nation. The trauma of this period and its aftermath is something that today's Algerians are still trying to shake from their collective memory. While you're here with us, we'd like to invite you to explore our Ko-fi page. If you don't know what Ko-fi is, it's essentially Patreon without all the censorship and political baggage. Your support on Ko-fi directly fuels our ability to produce unique and exciting content that might otherwise remain hidden in the depths of the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of our existing videos, like the ones on the Chaco War, the Beagle conflict, and Maurice Cohen's incredible journey, haven't received the recognition we believe they truly deserve. But we're determined not to shy away from such important topics, even if they might not align with the algorithm's preferences for promotion. With your support on Ko-fi, we can give videos like these a second chance, ensuring that these valuable stories and insights reach a wider audience without any concerns about our profitability month by month. We also haven't forgotten to include some awesome weekly and monthly perks for our supporters, so make sure you check out the link below. July 5th, 1962 was a moment of jubilation in Algiers, Algeria. After 132 years of French occupation, the city and the country was free. People took to the streets, ready to express their joy as free, independent Algerians. In her book, Algeria 1962, historian Malika Rahal describes a multi-day party on the streets of the capital, during which, according to eyewitnesses, even the women didn't come back for the night. After 8 years of fighting, the Front Liberation Nationale were victorious. They'd succeeded not only in their campaign of violent resistance to French rule, but also in their strategies of international diplomacy. The eyes of the world had settled on Algeria, and the French had no choice but to bring their era of North African colonialism to an end. But this had been a war, a real war, and the end of such a struggle always brings happiness tinged with sadness. As political prisoners and POWs were released and returned to their families, they brought with them stories of comrades, husbands, brothers, sons who'd been killed in the fighting. Algeria may have been freed, but it bore the deep scars of liberation. The FLN now had a new challenge on their hands. As freedom fighters, battling in opposition to a repressive foreign regime, they'd achieved real successes. Now, they must transition into a phase of legitimate Algerian-led governance. The future of the nation hung in the balance. In July 1962, the FLN took their first steps in this phase of transition. Ahmed Ben Bella, Houari Boumediene, and Mohamed Kader founded the Algerian Politburo, installing Ben Bella as Algerian premier the following May. Combining the socialism that had won them such support from the Soviet Union and other members of the communist bloc during the struggle for independence, with the Islamic ideologies that had been rooted in Algerian society for centuries, the FLN proved popular, but trouble was already brewing in the fledgling post-colonial nation. Houari Boumediene had been chief of staff for the ALN, the FLN's military arm, during the struggle against the French. He still wielded great power among the armed forces, and in 1965, he staged a coup that would overthrow Ben Bella and install himself as the nation's leader. For the next 13 years, Boumediene retained power along with his Council of Revolution, while the FLN served as an ideological apparatus in the background. History's judgment on Boumediene's rule is inconclusive. There were some positive aspects. Algeria benefited from the oil price spike of the 1970s and was generally able to avoid the spiraling levels of national debt suffered by other nations navigating their way out of colonialism. Throughout the 70s, Algeria's economy grew by around 6% a year on average, while infant mortality rates fell significantly and literacy soared. But Boumediene also risked isolating Algeria on the world stage. In 1971, state controls on Algeria's oil industry shattered the special relationship she'd had with France. In 1975, Algeria very nearly went to war with its neighbour Morocco over access to the Atlantic coast. Unemployment remained high in Algeria, and the country was dependent on foreign imports. There was also a political line to be navigated: establishing lucrative industrial contracts with the communist bloc without falling under its yoke. Sometimes Boumediene and his council were successful, in other instances they weren't. When Boumediene died in 1978, aged only 51, a member of his Council of Revolution took power in his place. Chadi Benjedid had been a soldier in the ALN, later becoming a colonel and one of Boumediene's most trusted men during his 13 years in power. Benjedid would govern Algeria through another period of transition and change, right up to the bloody events of the Civil War. Benjedid was not unopposed in his bid for the premiership. Two other men, Mohamed Salah Yahayaoui and Abdulaziz Bouteflika, stood in the colonel's way following the death of Boumediene. Bouteflika was an experienced politician who had served as Algeria's foreign secretary and sat at the United Nations ever since the country's independence back in '62. Governments in the West, looking on nervously at the unfolding situation in Algeria, were backing Bouteflika, who was considered a liberal and someone open to democratic reform. Yahayaoui, on the other hand, was more left-leaning. This was the man of choice for hardline communists, and the politician had championed the Algerian Parti de l'Avant-Garde Socialiste as they gained control over trade unions and youth organizations in the country. In the end, Benjedid represented something of a compromise for a country unsure of which direction it would take in a new decade. Almost immediately, Benjedid showed himself to be more economically liberal than leftist, ending the state monopoly on the nation's oil industry and scaling back on centralized economic control. The new premier also proved to be less authoritarian than his predecessor, reducing the surveillance of Algerian citizens. Not everyone supported these moves. Many in Benjedid's government felt that the premier's actions represented a dismantling of the state, and they called for moves back to Boumediene's more socialist communist model of governance. Rifts in Algeria's political landscape were made worse when oil prices tumbled in 1986, hitting the country's already faltering economy hard. Benjedid's government introduced austerity measures in an attempt to bring the situation under control. This did not go down well with the population that was already suffering. Inflation drove consumer prices sky high, and the cost of living soared. Unemployment, already a problem back in the 1970s, had continued throughout the new decade and made the situation intolerable, particularly for the youth who struggled to support themselves. On October 5th, 1988, the people decided they'd had enough. Protests began across the country, and the mood turned sourer still as the government clamped down on dissent. Rumors of massacres began to spread. In Algiers, government troops murdered 25 marchers, and the protesters decided to meet violence with violence. What would become known as La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, claimed around 500 lives and wounded a further 1,000. Once again, the eyes of the world were on Algeria and on the heavy-handed tactics employed by Benjedid and his security forces. As the violence came to an end on October 11th, Benjedid found himself in a difficult position. The Bloody Week had shaken the country and its government to its very core. Repressive strong-arm tactics might work in the short term, but they were only a sticking plaster on the festering wound of Algeria's economic woes and social divisions. A sticking plaster that could quite easily be ripped off. Benjedid returned to the moderate politics that had won him power in the first place, and he promised a raft of reforms, including greater democratization and political action, as well as institutional changes. A new constitution was drafted and was approved by a referendum in March of 1989. The constitution was carefully worded, avoiding references to socialism, limiting the armed forces to a national defense role, and pledging that Algeria would be a land of Islam. A multi-party state, combining liberalized economic and social policy with religious unity, Algeria was moving toward democracy. At least, it appeared to be. Benjedid's actions following the riots of 1988 could be regarded as a survival strategy. The unrest demonstrated the desire for political reforms and social change, but there was another threat to the status quo of Algeria. The beleaguered premier's promise that Algeria would be a land of Islam was likely a move to placate and defang the growing Islamist sentiment in the country and to reassure those who may have felt that Algeria had lost sight of its religious roots. Mustafa Bouyali had fought with the ALN during Algeria's long struggle for independence, rising to the rank of captain. Following the war, Bouyali was expelled from the FLN after forming ties with the Socialist Forces Front before disappearing from the political and military landscape altogether. In 1980, he began preaching at El Ashou Mosque in Algiers, gathering quite a following as he decried the creeping Western influence in Algeria. When his brother, Mokhtar, was shot by police in 1982, Bouyali's views hardened, and he became committed to what he viewed as righteous violence. As leader of the Algerian Islamic Armed Movement, or MIA, Bouyali began planning a range of audacious attacks, including the assassination of high-ranking politicians. When security forces broke up his group, Bouyali fled, but the Imam returned to Algeria in 1985. The MIA, now through with making empty threats, began a campaign of very real violence. Over the next 18 months, Bouyali and his MIA fighters inflicted significant damage to what they considered to be un-Islamic institutions, as well as significant casualties on the government forces that came after them. By 1987, the MIA was finished, but the seeds of Islamism had been sown. Ali Benhaj had been one of the MIA fighters arrested by Algerian forces. Following his release, Benhaj remained committed to the Islamist cause, and when Benjedid's government announced democratic reforms, he saw an opportunity. Along with Abbasi Madani, Benhaj founded the Front Islamique du Salut, the Islamic Salvation Front, or FIS. A political party rather than a paramilitary organization, the FIS sought to appeal to Algeria's Muslim majority, particularly those who felt that secular socialism had failed the country. While nominally not violent, the FIS was certainly no moderate organization. With fiery rhetoric drawn straight from decontextualized verses of the Quran, they sought to ignite the flame of discord in Algeria. The group's own slogan was, "And you were on the brink of the pit of fire, and he saved you from it." Whether this fiery pit was Soviet socialism or Western liberalism, it didn't matter. For the FIS and its supporters, there was only one way forward. The FIS made rapid gains among the disaffected Algerians. After an earthquake in Tipaza province, the group sent medical and rescue personnel, as well as financial support, to aid the victims. Promises to institute Sharia law proved popular, as did pledges to eradicate French language and culture from Algeria. An increasing number of citizens joined the FIS cause, marching in rallies and getting involved in demonstrations. On June 12, 1990, Algerians went to the polls for the first time since liberation. As expected, the FIS did very well indeed in these local government elections, taking 54% of the votes, twice that of FLN, and taking control of vast regions of the country. Of towns and cities with over 50,000 inhabitants, 93% went to the FIS. With general elections planned for the following year, things were looking good for the FIS. But there were issues to be overcome. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait, for instance, the FIS were dead against it, condemning the action as damaging to the pan-Islamic cause. When Western governments launched their own invasion of Iraq in response, however, the FIS immediately U-turned. A difficult political situation had just about been averted. And then there were the political forces at play within Algeria. Terrified by the sudden gains of the FIS, the FLN began a process of gerrymandering, shifting the boundaries of electoral districts to hobble the Islamists' progress. The FIS called a general strike in response to this, and demonstrations tore through the country once again. In December 1991, Algeria went back to the polls, this time for the first round of the parliamentary elections. The FLN was tense, and they had a right to be. In the end, the FIS won 188 of 231 seats up for grabs, taking nearly half of the popular vote. The FLN had agreed to a democratic process, but not to this democratic process. The army, fearful of what was coming, decided to break the bonds of the 1989 constitution and cancelled the election before a second round could be held. Ben Jadid was forced to resign while Mohammed Boudiaf was installed as president. A state of emergency was called, and as many as 40,000 FIS militants and politicians were rounded up and arrested. Once again, Algeria was in crisis. Following the coup, civil war was basically inevitable. But with so many FIS militants arrested and detained, who was going to do the fighting? For the first 12 months after the army seized power, underground groups operated in secret, coalescing and building their power. One such group was the MIA, who decided that the time for politics was over and the time for violence had returned. Another was the Groupe Islamique Armée, the Armed Islamic Group, or GIA. While the MIA sought to mount a concerted military effort against the state, the GIA's aims, methods, and means were more immediate. The GIA began a program of mayhem, attacking and killing anyone deemed to be impeding Algeria's course toward a theocratic, Sharia-focused system. Teachers, journalists, intellectuals, and officials were in the GIA's sights, and many were murdered. By autumn of 1993, GIA had expanded their scope. They began targeting anyone they viewed as un-Islamic or unwilling to live by their code, including foreigners. 26 foreigners had been murdered by the end of the year, and almost all others left the country in fear. In 1994, support for the FIS began to coalesce. What had been a fairly loose collection of generally aligned groups, including the MIA among others, became a more cohesive force known as the AIS, or the Islamic Salvation Army. In areas controlled by the more hardline GIA, sentiment began to change. The GIA had been welcomed by many who wished to exact their revenge on the government. But harsh systems of taxation and a breakdown in law and order pushed many toward the more moderate Islamist doctrine of the FIS and AIS. Outwardly, however, the GIA remained confident. They began hitting targets outside of Algeria, hijacking Air France Flight 8969 in December and killing 3 passengers, causing outrage in France. The group also began taking on its fellow Islamists in the AIS, who they now viewed as just another enemy. Guerrilla fighting between the groups continued into 1995. November of 1995 saw another round of elections in Algeria. The FIS were dead against this and urged a boycott. The GIA were rather more forthright. "One vote, one bullet" was their slogan. Despite the FIS's pleas and the GIA's threats, turnout was good. Liamin Zerwal, already head of Algeria's High Council of State, was elected president, but Islamist candidates also performed well. The realization that Islamist interests could be represented through a democratic process was a turning point for many, and both AIS and GIA fighters began questioning if a seemingly endless cycle of violence was really the right way to go about things after all. Not everyone was done with violence, however. GIA factions began purging, which usually meant killing any members they suspected of veering toward a more moderate path. Government supporters outside of the military also began taking up arms, and pro-Zerwal militias emerged throughout the country. A new constitution, ratified by a referendum, brought more optimism to Algeria. Another round of elections in 1997 increased this mood of hopefulness still further. Once again, Zerwal emerged victorious, while the FLN and the Islamist Party Movement of Society for Peace, previously named Hamas, gained significant representation. The government's handling of the FIS shifted, and for a while, it looked as if the conflict might be coming to an end. But the GIA was moving in the opposite direction. After the assassination of Jamel Zitouni in 1996, the hardliners had a new leader, Antar Zouabri, and the war was entering one of its grimmest phases. From 1997 to 1998, Algeria was the scene of countless massacres as the GIA sought to establish and consolidate control in rural areas. 18 of these massacres claimed at least 50 lives. In August and September 1997, massacres at Rice and Bentala saw a total of more than 400 people murdered. According to one survivor at Bentala, villagers were allegedly told, "We have the whole night to rape your women and children, drink your blood. Even if you escape today, we'll come back tomorrow to finish you off. We're here to send you to your God." In what would later become known as the Black Decade, it's these mass killings that have left the deepest impression on Algerians. Even those committed to the hardline GIA cause would have found it difficult to stomach such barbarity, while those aligned to the government militias may have questioned why the armed forces did nothing to prevent these atrocities. For the GIA themselves, this final flurry of violence was a death knell. Following on from the softening of relations between the FIS and the government, the AIS began a unilateral truce on October 1st, 1997. The AIS now had a single enemy, the GIA. The GIA, on the other hand, had multiple enemies: the government, the AIS, and themselves. In the wake of the horrific massacres of 1997 and 1998, infighting broke out among GIA factions, and a number of commanders left the organization. Increasingly marginalized, the GIA were weakened further after the election of Abdulaziz Bouteflika to the presidency in April 1999. Under Bouteflika, negotiations with the FIS progressed, and the AIS eventually agreed to lay down its arms. An amnesty introduced by the new president offered leniency for any disaffected Islamist fighters who had not committed rape or murder. The stream of fighters leaving the GIA accelerated, and the organization fought a losing battle against the strengthened government forces. After the September 11th attacks in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, Bouteflika gained increased support from the United States in his fight against the GIA. The killing of Zouabri in February 2002 effectively meant the end of the GIA. The Algerian Civil War lingered on for another 2 years after the death of Zouabri. Around 300 former GIA fighters remained active, fighting under the banner of the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, or the GSPC, an Islamist group aligned with Al-Qaeda. Sporadic attacks killed Algerian soldiers and police officers, while the group gained international attention with the kidnapping of 32 European tourists in February 2003. The attacks decreased in frequency until the group was absorbed into Al-Qaeda in 2007. The 2004 presidential elections, along with an extension of the amnesty offered to Islamist fighters, essentially brought about the end of the Algerian Civil War, although a state of emergency would remain in place until 2007. It was time for Algerians to count the cost of the Black Decade. By some estimates, the war cost as many as 200,000 lives, although many believe the toll to be even higher than this. Countless people were displaced across the country, and more than 10 years of warfare, on top of decades of political strife and uncertainty, shattered the Algerian economy and destroyed much of its civilian infrastructure. It also left Algerians fearful of political turmoil and uprising. In 2011, as the Arab Spring protests gripped much of North Africa and the Middle East, Algeria was a notable absentee. Unspeakable horrors and decades of hardship have left Algeria struggling to pick up the pieces. However, there is measured optimism. Literacy rates have increased in the years since the war as the country's education system develops, while GDP has soared. Protests and voter abstentions in 2017 and 2019 did not spill over into widespread discord, and today's Algerians are hopeful that the dark shadow of violence is now long, long behind them. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.